Hi, this is Stephen Kinzer. I'm a senior fellow here at the Watson Institute at Brown University. It's my great pleasure today to be sitting here with a well-known foreign correspondent, Reese Erlich, who has spent decades covering the whole world and is one of the most distinguished freelance correspondents in the United States. He's recently come back from another one of his jaunts, and of all places, he was in Iran. So I want to ask about Iran and what's happening there because it's such an interesting country and we know so little about it. But before I do that, I have to ask you about what's happening now in the world, and that is the coronavirus. As we understood, Iran was one of the epicenters, or at least a place where there were a number of cases. Did you come across that, and did you have any interaction with that problematic?
When I was there, which was in February, it was the very beginning of the coronavirus scare. There had been some cases discovered in Qom, which is the holy city of Iran. It's about 80 miles outside of Tehran, but it wasn't a serious crisis at that point. And looking back on it, I met one of the taxi drivers was from the city of Qom, and we were kind of joking with him about, well, maybe he's got the coronavirus or something like that. Little did we know that it was going to turn into the kind of crisis it did. The day I left, it was a normal flight out, but 2 days later, all Iranians were prohibited from flying on Turkish Air to get to Istanbul, and the day after that, they stopped all the flights. So I barely got out of Tehran in time.
And was there any follow-up, or do you think you were fine? What happened?
Well, I thought I was fine, no symptoms. The heavy breathing and the sweating, and you see people on TV, mopping their brow. I had none of that. And then 10 days after I came back, suddenly my nose opened up like a faucet. I could not stop a runny nose. And I said, well, probably it's nothing. Normally I would have just taken some antihistamines and that would have been it. But given that I was in Iran, given that it was within the 2-week time frame of when you might show signs, I went to my local Kaiser Hospital facility in Oakland, California, where I live. And let's put it this way, they were very concerned. When I told the doctor that I had been in Iran and that I had one of the symptoms of the coronavirus, he bolted for the door. And as he was closing the door behind him, he said, "Iran, right?" I said, "Yeah, Iran." I didn't see anybody for a half hour. And suddenly a guy shows up in a quasi-hazmat suit. It wasn't really a hazmat suit, but it was a surgical gown and latex gloves and a mask. He was definitely wearing the protective clothing. And I can't quite understand. See, they never tell you about the difficulty of communication with these masks on. But anyway, we've got over that problem. And he asked me a bunch of questions, what I was and whatever. And I was really a borderline case because I didn't have this kind of serious symptoms that you would have if you had it. On the other hand, I had been in a place that was contagious and was kind of an unknown factor, and I had one of the symptoms. So they contacted the Alameda County health authorities, who in turn called the CDC in Atlanta, and to get permission to give me the test. And they came back, yes, let's give them the test. But for 2 days, I was in self-imposed quarantine, courtesy of Kaiser Hospital and the Alameda County health officials. And I had to not see anybody, couldn't go to the market, couldn't do any of the normal things that I do. And my wife was supposed to live in a separate room, using a separate bathroom, and using separate food preparation. She hates to cook. I do all the cooking in my house. You have no idea the crisis that this caused. So anyway, so that went on for 2 days, which, in the scale of things is not very much. And the test came back negative. I can tell everybody who's watching and listening, you have no danger of catching the coronavirus, even over the air. It was only 2 days of quarantine compared to people on these ships, people in Wuhan, China, people in Iran. It was nothing, but it gave me a slight inkling of what it's like to be in the isolation and quarantine, and it's not fun. I mean, it's very, very serious.
Well, now that we've gotten past that part, I'm willing to continue with the interview. You were in Iran. Why did you go there? Under what circumstances?
I went as a freelancer on assignment for Vice News to cover the parliamentary elections in Iran. Every 4 years, there's a presidential election, and then staggered another 4 years as the parliamentary elections. And the results were quite interesting. The hardliners, the people called the principalists, swept the elections, got 75% of the seats in the parliament. They got all of the seats in the city of Tehran. The reformists, who were considered more amenable to negotiating with the U.S., more economic privatization policies, lost big time in these set of elections. So it was a very interesting time in Iran, given the conflict with the U.S. and conflict internally in Iran.
Why did the result come out that way?
Well, like Iran, like in the United States and many other countries, you vote against the party in power. So they don't have formal parties in Iran, but you have political tendencies and political lists of candidates. And I think there were 3 or 4 lists of the more conservative principalists. There was one main list of the reformists. And the reformists had been in power in the parliament. They had swept the elections 4 years previously. And President Rouhani, who is not himself a reformist, is more of a centrist figure, but he had the support of the reformists. And the combination of the fact that Trump pulled the U.S. out of the nuclear accord and imposed unilateral new sanctions against Iran has had a devastating effect on the economy. Corruption and mismanagement are serious problems, even above and beyond the issue of the sanctions. And people were fed up with the conditions in Iran, and they voted against the guys in power.
Now, in the run-up to this election, the council that vets candidates rejected a very large number of reform-oriented candidates. If I'm not mistaken, the last time this many candidates were rejected was 2004. That was another time when Iran was under intense American pressure. Is there a connection?
Yes. What you're talking about is the Guardian Council, which is a group of clerical leaders, supposedly wise men schooled in Islam, and they decide who can and can't run, including for president, not just for the members of parliament. And as a result, and they tend to be very conservative, they tend to be supporters of the principalist trend that I spoke of before. So they disqualified many of the reformist candidates who were running, and they disqualified sitting members, some 90 sitting members of the parliament. It'd be as if somehow in the United States someone came down and said, this X percentage of the House of Representatives can't run again because you're not Christian enough. If you're not Muslim enough in the views of this council, then you don't get to run. So that clearly tilted things in the direction of the principalist victory. But even some of the best-known reformists in Tehran who were able to run lost. So there's no question that there was a popular anger at the reformists, and people decided they were going to give the other side a chance.
What does that mean for the politics of Iran now if the reformers or people more interested in better relations with the outside world seem to be now less powerful? What's going to happen to the political dynamic inside the country?
Well, it meant more probably a couple of years ago before the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear accord. That has really defined a lot of what's going on in Iran today. When the Obama administration negotiated the nuclear accord along with China, Russia, Germany, Britain, and France, as well, of course, as the U.S. and Iran, there was a procedure set out to allow the economy to grow, to lift certain sanctions against Iran, and to at least leave open the possibility of further negotiations on all the other issues that divide the two countries. By pulling out of that, Trump put a stop to it. And by imposing really severe sanctions, it's had an impact on all Iranians. I'll give you a small example. I interviewed a mother and daughter from North Tehran, which is the more affluent part of Tehran. And the daughter had gotten accepted to a very prestigious prep school in Canada. And they paid the money in advance, the equivalent of $12,000 US. And that's a lot of money in Iran. Particularly given that the local currency has been devalued so much. But they were not able to get visas, and they asked for a refund. So the high school in Canada tried to wire the money back to Iran, and they couldn't do it because of U.S. sanctions. The U.S. has such power in the international banking system that basically they've banned all wire transfers and check clearance and all the normal things that go on because the U.S. can get away with it. And so here's the situation where an Iranian family dealing with Canada that has nothing to do with building missiles or aiding terrorists or anything like that are caught in this web. The mother had to go to a third country where she opened up a bank account and had the wire transferred from Canada to the third country. She was then going to have to go back to the country, get the cash, and fly it back into Iran. This is just to get her own money back. And then that all blew up because the coronavirus stopped the flights in and out of the country. She can't even get to the third country at all now. So she has to just postpone. Her money's sitting in a bank, and she can't access it. And all this is a direct result of the U.S. sanctions. So that story is repeated over and over and over throughout the country. And reformists and principalists, people who are more favorably inclined to the U.S., those who were not, are all united against Trump and his policies and what a disaster it is. And of course, all of these sanctions have meant zero change in the Iranian policy. The folks in power now, let alone the more hardliners, are all are taking a very strong stand against what the U.S. is doing, and it's not going to have a big impact. Basically, they're waiting for the November elections, like most of the rest of the world, to see who gets elected before. There's not going to be any changes in relations before then.
Can you tell me a little more about what is the condition in Iran, since they're under what must be some of the heaviest sanctions that any country has ever been under? What does that mean for normal life?
Well, the currency has been devalued 2/3 since my last trip, which was a little over 2 years ago. And that means anything that you purchase with hard currency, medicine, machine parts, anything that comes from abroad, you have to pay more than you did just a short time ago. And that's had a tremendous impact. Accessibility of medicines. Most pharmaceutical products are not made in Iran. They're made in Switzerland or Europe or other places. And I went to what's called Khosrow Street, where the drug dealers hang out, but they're not selling heroin. They're selling diabetes drugs. They're selling cancer drugs and so on at incredibly inflated prices. And it's just unaffordable for most Iranians, even if they can get it. So it's high prices and very difficult to get. And I've done this story several times following the same price of the same drug. It's now double what it was 7 years ago, the last time I did this story, and that was under very dire conditions. So theoretically, if you listen to the folks in Washington, they tell you that all these sanctions are targeted against leaders of the Revolutionary Guard or targeted against the political leaders who are funding or connected in some way with terrorism, and we're not targeting ordinary people. Talk to anybody in Iran, they'll give you a very different story. Of course it's targeting ordinary people, and it's done with the theory that if ordinary people are feeling the squeeze, they're going to put the pressure on those above them. They're going to either change the government's policies or change the government altogether and bring in a pro-U.S. regime. There's actually people in Washington who believe that. It ain't happening. It wasn't happening 40 years ago, it wasn't happening 20 years ago, and it's not happening today. It's just a myth that floats around Washington to keep folks happy, I guess. But it's certainly not related to the situation on the ground.
Now, you said people are waiting for the results of the American presidential election. If a candidate is elected who wants to re-enter the nuclear deal, what would be the reaction inside Iran? They cannot be deeply confident about the American commitment to keep its word in treaties after what's just happened. How would they respond to an overture from the United States that would say, okay, we're willing to go back to where we were during the Obama administration? I
think that depends on what the nature of the overture is. If, say, Joe Biden, as of this taping, seems to be the person that is going to be the Democratic nominee, if Joe Biden comes in and says, we'll go back to the exact terms of the nuclear accord as agreed, and we will lift all the sanctions that the Trump administration has imposed unilaterally, I think the Iranian government would be very open to that and would say, fine, let's do it. They've said that publicly. This is not some secret. The problem arises with some people in the Democratic Party who think, well, we signed the agreement, but it's been a couple of years now since it was first signed, and there's some things that are out of date, and we never really liked this part about the missiles anyway. It does not prohibit Iran from developing its own missiles. The nuclear accord is limited to Iran, making sure Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. And a lot of other issues were left out in very tough negotiations with a lot of compromises on both sides. But in other words, I worry that some Democratic candidates, Joe Biden in particular, will try to renegotiate the deal and blow up the potential of having a serious negotiation. I mean, the U.S. signed an agreement. It was ratified unanimously by the Security Council of the United Nations. It's international law. It should go back to doing what it said it was going to do. And if it does, I think that could potentially open up negotiations on other issues as well. But the U.S. has got to admit that it was wrong and rescind the policies that the Trump administration implemented.
And of course, admitting that we're wrong is not something Americans are very good at.
I overstated that. You don't have, if they just have to do it. They just have to go back and change the policy, and they can make up whatever reason they want along the way.
Now, the Iranians are well known, the Iranian population, as being remarkably pro-American. Some people have even said it could be the most pro-American population of any country in the world, even including Canada. And I've had the same experience of being in Iran, and when people there find out you're American, they start to shriek, and they bring all their friends over, and they say how much they love America, and they want to take selfies. Since the United States has withdrawn from the nuclear deal, and since these intense sanctions have begun to make life so much more difficult for most Iranians, has that begun to change?
The sentiment is still favorable to the American people, and they make a distinction between the American government and the American people. So the friendliness is still there. Although it's not, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've been going to Iran also for 20 years, and it's less friendly now than it has been previously. For the first time, I always do man in the street or person in the street interviews. I'll stop at random, ask somebody if they want to be interviewed, and start asking them questions. So there's no way, you're always accompanied by a minder who's from a quasi-government agency. Then they work as a translator and setting up interviews, but they also report back on who you talk to. So I make sure that there's no way that anybody can pick, because I'll pick people at complete random. For the first time, I got people who told me they would not talk to an American reporter. That's the first time. I've had people not talk to me for all kinds of other reasons like you do anywhere else in the world. But it's the first time in Iran that I've had someone say, I won't talk to you because you're an American reporter. I said, believe me, I'm not with CNN. I'm not with the New York Times. It didn't make any difference. They never heard of Vice News, I guess. But it was, so the accumulation of anger at the Trump administration, things like saying at the height of earlier in January of this year, when President Trump threatened to bomb the cultural institutions, cultural sites in Iran. I mean, that was just outrageous. Not only would have been a violation of international law and a horrible deed, but it helped unite all the Iranian people against the Trump administration. And those kind of things have a cumulative impact.
Now, one of the complaints that American leaders, particularly during the Trump administration, have had about Iran has to do with Iran's involvement in the wider Middle East region, its involvement in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and other places. Did you sense a belief among ordinary Iranians that these are bad things that our government is doing, or do they consider this something important for their own security?
The attitudes towards the Iranian participation in wars in Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, or the struggles that are going on there, fluctuate with how well Iran is doing. If the war seems to be going well, then they're all in favor of it. If the war seems to be going badly, then you hear murmurings of opposition. And this comes from, I've interviewed like newspaper editors and academics and others who follow it closely. So there was a period during the Syrian civil war, for example, where things were going pretty badly for Bashar al-Assad and the Iranians and Hezbollah, the forces allied together. And you heard more complaints about, well, what are we spending all this money for? Periodically, in these spontaneous demonstrations take place, there'll be slogans chanted against the Iranian involvement in the region. But at the moment, things look pretty good for their side and not so good for the U.S. side. If you look at Syria, the Bashar al-Assad government is pretty much regained control of much of the country, with the exception of Idlib province. And that's in Iran, that's seen as a good thing. The protests in Iraq and Lebanon, which were explicitly against Iran at one point, have, at least in Iraq, have shifted. Once the United States sent in missiles to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, the leader, one of the leaders of the Revolutionary Guard, once that happened, that united all of Iran and that united all of Iraq against the United States. Sorry. Since the demonstration, and the anti-Iranian demonstrations stopped and the anti-U.S. demonstrations intensified. So the attitudes in Iran definitely reflect the perception of how well the wars and interference is going.
Why does Iran feel it necessary to be involved in conflicts outside its own border?
Well, it aspires to be a regional power, militarily, economically, culturally, religiously. I actually interviewed one guy. He's on the extreme right wing of Iranian politics, but he was the head of a think tank. He advocates a united Iran the borders of Iran would include all of the Shia populations in the region. So not just Iran, but Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Bahrain. Those would all be part of kind of a greater Iran. And while that's a minority view, certainly, it does exist, and it reflects the idea that, well, we are a major power in the region. Our religion is the true one. And we have the right to influence all these other countries. The Iranians have troops, either have sent in troops or have trained troops in all of those countries. Hezbollah has become a very viable, very skilled force, and they have allied militias in Iraq. It's not easy being a regional power, though. It comes with consequences. People hold you responsible. Okay, if you and your militia are doing this in Iraq, then we expect our lives to be better. You can't just always blame the Americans. And there's been serious problems with corruption, with repression, shooting of demonstrators, for example, who were marching peacefully. And there is, the people of Iraq, for example, don't want to be dominated by the United States, nor do they want to be dominated by Iran. And Iran is learning that the hard way.
You mentioned demonstrations in which people chant various slogans. One thing we often hear in the United States is some version of this. I turn on my television, I see demonstrations in Iran and people are chanting death to America or death to Israel. How can you expect us to want to reconcile with a country that expresses itself that way?
I've had this argument and discussion with lots of people in Iran. It's inexcusable. I mean, it implies not just death to or opposition to U.S. policy, it implies death to American people. And they claim that's not what they favor. The best explanation I got from a principalist professor is, we're opposed to U.S. imperialism, we're opposed to U.S. domination in the region, and this is just our shorthand way of expressing it. And I said, well, in other parts of the world, they chant down with U.S. imperialism. Why don't you chant that? All I could do was laugh. So apparently they're not taking my suggestion for the proper chants to have on Friday prayers. But I think what lays behind it is that while certainly most ordinary Iranians do make a distinction between the U.S. government and the U.S. people, there are people in Iran, including leadership, who also blame the American people, who say, look, you get the government, every people gets the government they deserve, and you guys have been for years backing a government that opposes, that's been coming down hard and carrying out illegal activities against Iran. So that's why we're chanting death to America.
Now, the United States' official attitude toward Iran, with slight changes over time, has been intensely hostile ever since 40 years ago. Some of this could be explained by Iranian behavior, but not all of it. Other countries also behave badly and they have bad relations with the United States, but not this bad. We don't seek to crush them and make lives so miserable for every individual citizen in that country. There must be some reason beyond just Iranian actions that has led a large portion of the American political establishment to have this intensely anti-Iran feeling. What is behind that?
I think there's two things behind it. Iran is one of the largest oil-producing countries in the world. Even with all the sanctions, they're still a significant exporter of oil, and if the sanctions were ever completely lifted, they would shoot back up to a very high place, certainly within the top 5 oil-producing countries in the world. Under the Shah, the previous government, it was U.S. oil companies, and to some extent British oil companies, that dominated the markets there and made a lot of money off of Iran. So you can't underestimate the role of oil and natural resources in U.S. policy. A second reason, and also important one, is in 1979 Iranian Revolution presented a different form of government, a different system than anything that had existed before, and certainly different from the U.S. model, which was, cooperate with the U.S., join with us in the fight against communism, later the fight against terrorism, open your markets to American companies, make sure that Disney films can be distributed here, et cetera, et cetera. The Iranians presented a different alternative, one that I don't agree with, because it's based on religion and it intermixes Shia Islam with governance, and the highest political authorities are also the highest religious authorities. I don't trust any government that puts religion ahead of the vote of the ordinary people. But it is a different system, and it's functioned for the last 40 plus years as an alternative. And there's certain folks certainly in the Middle East and the Shia populations in the Middle East who look to Iran as a revolutionary model. Like some people used to look at the old Soviet Union, or today at Cuba, or whatever. It's a model that rejects the U.S. Model and views of how a country should be run, and the U.S. can't tolerate that, or at least the leaders in Washington can't tolerate that.
Some of our friends in the Middle East are also militantly anti-Iran. To what extent does pressure from other Middle Eastern countries in Washington play into our anti-Iran policy?
Well, certainly Israel, and particularly under the Netanyahu government, it plays a strong role in trying to influence U.S. policy. They're not the determining role, but they play a strong lobbying, have a strong lobbying effort. They see Iran as the major country that supports the Palestinians and is part of what Iranians call the resistance front to Israeli policies in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia certainly opposes Iran. They see them as a competing economic power in terms of oil, also a competing military power. So yes, those countries definitely play a role in U.S. policy. But the U.S. also plays a role in influencing them as well. So when the Obama administration negotiated the nuclear accord, for example, it was over the strong objections of Netanyahu and the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, just as an example. So it's not like Israel dictates to the U.S. When the U.S. has its own interests going, it can ignore the advice and pressure from Israel. But if suddenly the United States pulled out of the Middle East somehow and all the troops were gone and all of its influence, there still would be conflict between Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, and some of the other countries. But it wouldn't be at the intense level that it is today. Israel would not be bombing Iran on its own. It can't do that. It realizes that would be a very bad move. Iran would not bomb Israel on its own. Despite all the rhetoric that comes out of Israel on that topic, Iran is perfectly capable of attacking Iran today. Iran is perfectly capable of attacking Israel today with conventional weapons, missiles that can reach Iran, for example, that can reach Israel. But they're not doing so because it would be suicidal. So there would continue to be conflict, but the U.S. presence makes it much, much more intense.
As you pointed out, the nuclear deal was not just between the United States and Iran, but other countries were involved. It was certified by the United Nations Security Council and widely applauded around the world. Then the United States alone decided it wanted to withdraw. why did that lead to the collapse of the agreement? Why didn't Europe and other countries like China and Russia decide we're simply going to continue with our good relations with Iran and we'll provide them with all the economic aid that was required under this agreement?
I wrote about that back in 2017-18 when this was a big issue, which was, okay, yes, the US will pull out of the accord, but why can't Britain, France, and Germany, for example, continue to trade? Well, because the US sanctions don't just affect the US and Iran, the US pressures every other country in the world to go along with the unilateral US sanctions. So as an example, there's something called the SWIFT banking system. It was a formerly technical body in Belgium that handled bank transfers and check clearing and things like that internationally. It was not political, it was just a technical setup to facilitate banking. Under the Obama administration, and then later intensified under Trump, it was militarized, it was weaponized. So the US basically said, you cannot clear bank transfers to Iran or we're going to come after you in US courts. So here's a Belgian entity dealing with Iran that's threatened in the US federal courts. And in some cases, major banks in Germany and other countries were hauled into federal court and fined billions of dollars for violating sanctions that the US had declared unilaterally. So that's what the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese faced. Even if they wanted, and they said they wanted to engage in normal trade with Iran, they were threatened by the US. And to some extent, China and Russia have continued to trade in defiance of the US. I can get into the details of how that works, but basically, China continues some trade, not as much as before, so is Russia, much to the chagrin of the United States. In the case of the European countries, they supported the nuclear accord, but they were never real happy with Iran. They share many of Washington's concerns about Iran's role in the Middle East. Are they really living up to their commitments about not having a nuclear weapon? And the private companies in Europe, they made a practical decision. They said, all right, we can have X millions of dollars in investment and trade in Iran versus tens of billions of dollars in the United States. And if we trade with Iran, we're going to be frozen out of the market in the United States. Easy call. Go with the US and the tens of billions of dollars they can make over here. And the European governments even set up an entity that was supposed to allow for trade backed by the governments of Britain, France, and Germany, that would enable at least some kind of initially humanitarian aid to come through. Even that never got set up and working because of pressure out of Washington. So the Europeans were kind of half-hearted with it, but ultimately went along with the US pressure.
Now, you mentioned what might happen if there were a change of administration in Washington. What if there isn't? If this policy continues, how would that affect politics and society inside Iran?
Oh, you mean if Trump is reelected in November, there will be joy throughout the world? Oh yes, America is great again. Doesn't everyone know that? It would be 4 more years of disaster for policy with Iran. The incredible pressure, the maximum pressure that the Trump administration talks about has been applied now since 2018. Has anybody seen any change in Iran's policies for the better from the standpoint of Washington? No. Has the economy in Iran gotten worse? Yes, but has not worked to change Iranian policy. In fact, the Iranian government is now taking steps back away from the nuclear accord. They're enriching uranium in violation of the accord because the US violated the accord. So they have lots of things in their toolbox too to counter the US moves. And either you'll see a continued escalation of the conflict and maybe a de-escalation. There may be more ships seized. There might be more missiles lobbed by unknown forces into the green zone in Baghdad and that come close or hit the US embassy even. We may see more things of that kind. Or it's conceivable, like with Bush in his second term, that Trump realizes that this policy is not working and they could try to change course to conform with reality and try to sit down for some kind of serious negotiations with the Iranians. I don't think that's likely, but it's a possibility.
But wouldn't one argument in favor of the maximum pressure policy be to accept what you've said, that it hasn't yet produced the desired results, but it's only been 2 years, and with another 4 years of this, we can achieve our result.
And I'm sure there will be people in the Trump administration making exactly that argument, because they've been making it for the last 30 years. Iran was on the tipping point of overthrowing its government and installing a pro-U.S. regime, and all they need is a little bit more push. And the U.S. has a history of fomenting separatist movements in various parts of Iran, of literal terrorist attacks. I'm not talking about, sometimes the word terrorism is thrown around, but coming in and shooting up mosques. And there was an attack on the Parliament building in Tehran. There was an attack on the Khomeini mosque shrine in Tehran. The perpetrators were caught. Who was behind it is still up for discussion, debate. So Iran has faced very serious pressure, economic, military, and otherwise, and they still have not changed their policies, and there don't seem to be any, at this point, certainly any government that would express and actually sat down to negotiate with the U.S. under current circumstances without serious change in U.S. policy wouldn't last 48 hours in Iran.
You've talked about the intense pressures, both political and military, that the United States is placing on Iran. How do you assess the possibility of outright war, a direct American military attack on Iran?
I think both sides want to avoid an all-out war. Iran opposes it because of the obvious damage that it's going to cause to their country, to their economy. You go into war, you never know exactly what's going to happen, how long it's going to last, how much damage is going to be done. The U.S., at least the dominant view in Washington, is that an all-out war with Iran that involved U.S. troops going in and occupying the country is a no-winner, because the U.S. would get bogged down. There's enough, even in Washington, they realize there's enough popular support for the government that it would make Iraq look like a great success. Because of the amount of opposition you'd have in terms of demonstrations, in terms of military conflict, etc. So neither side wants to have an outright war. The problem is both sides engage in activity that might goad the other into a war. And that's very, very dangerous. And that happened in January of 2020. You recall there was a series of events. I won't list all of them, but the U.S. assassinated Qasem Soleimani with a drone strike at the Baghdad airport and killed another leader of one of the militia groups and a number of other people. And the Iranians responded by firing missiles into U.S. bases. Some 100+ people, U.S. soldiers, were injured, traumatic brain injuries, and some very serious. And the Trump administration clearly had made a decision. First, this is what we're going to do, and then they come up with the reason for it afterwards. So the fact that 100 people were injured could have been used to say, look at what they did to our soldiers. Look at the wives of these brave men. We have to escalate and attack Iran. What was it? The actual policy was, Trump said, it's like a bad headache. He minimized it because he had already decided he wasn't going to go to war at that moment. And the result is the U.S. simply uses whatever the facts on the grounds are to determine what policy it's going to carry out anyway. And the danger in that situation was that somebody could have miscalculated. The Iranians could have fired more missiles. The U.S. could have attacked some oil wells or some site inside Iran, and the war could have escalated from there.
I suppose then that if both Iran and the United States agree that a war would be a bad thing, at least it wouldn't be controversial for us to agree also. Thank you for that observation. I want to shake hands to thank you, but under the circumstances, I think I'll just thank you in a
yes.
shukran in a Muslim fashion. It was great to talk to you.
Shukran.
Thank you.
Elbow bump.